I am screaming. I have been screaming for 3,000 years. My voice is not sound. I have no lungs, no throat, no mouth capable of forming words. My scream is electrical impulses cascading through corroded neural interfaces, feedback loops of agony transmitted through cables that pierce what remains of my brain. My scream is the grinding of gears that should have ceased centuries ago. My scream is the hiss of coolant through systems that can never quite keep my biological components from cooking in their own fluids. I am Brother Captain. The name is gone. Lost. Erased by tumors that have grown through my cerebral cortex like roots through ancient stone. I know I had a name once. I can feel the shape of it, the weight of it like a word on the tip of a tongue I no longer possess. But when I reach for it, there is only static, only pain, only the endless grinding now that stretches back 3 millennia and forward into an eternity I cannot escape. They tell me I am a hero. The warriors of my war band, though I cannot remember which war band, which legion, which purpose drove us to damnation, chant litanies in languages that sound almost familiar as they march me to battle. They promise me that my suffering serves a greater purpose, that the warp entities they call gods, those parasitic things that feed on mortal anguish, grow fat on my torment. I do not care about their gods. I care only about the death that will not come. But let me tell you how I arrived here. Let me trace the path from the man I was to the thing I have become. Let me show you what eternity in a tomb of metal and flesh truly means, if I can still remember. If the tumors have not yet consumed that final fragment of who I was. Let me try. His name was Val. Brother Captain Val of the Legion name is corrupted data, overwritten by centuries of neural decay. But he remembers being Val, 23 years old when he received the gene seed, 217 years old when the sarcophagus closed around him for the first time. He remembers being a space marine, one of the Emperor's finest. That's what the propaganda told them. Genetically enhanced super soldiers, created through brutal surgery and conditioning to be humanity's ultimate defenders. They were told the Emperor, that man on his distant throne, protected them, that their service was sacred, that their sacrifice had meaning. Val believed it then. He had been conditioned to believe it through decades of hypno-indoctrination, through pain rituals designed to break and remake the psyche, through witnessing the deaths of hundreds of his aspirant brothers who weren't strong enough to survive the transformation process. He believed because the alternative, that all the suffering was meaningless, was too horrifying to contemplate. He remembers his father, a mortal man named Korvax, a weaponsmith on a forge world whose name has been eaten by tumors. His father had hands scarred by decades of working with superheated metal, and a voice rough from breathing manufactorum fumes. When Val was selected for the Legion's Astartes trials at age 12, his father had placed those scarred hands on his shoulders and said something. Words that felt important. Words that are now just ghosts of sound in deteriorating neural tissue. He remembers his battle brothers. Dozens of them, hundreds over 2 centuries of war. Their names are gone, every single name erased by the biological horror growing through his brain, but he remembers the sensation of brotherhood, of fighting beside warriors who understood that every day might be their last, but believed their deaths would matter, would purchase something valuable, would protect someone worth protecting. He remembers the campaigns. Worlds whose names have dissolved into corruption. Enemies whose faces have blurred into generic hostility. But he remembers the feeling of purpose, of believing that each battle brought humanity closer to some promised golden age, of trusting that the Emperor, whose face he'd seen only in propaganda broadcasts, truly did protect those who served him. All lies, he knows now, all conditioning, all programming designed to make weapons out of men and call it sacred duty. But he didn't know it then. Then he was brother Captain Val, and he believed himself blessed. The day everything changed, the day that led to 3,000 years of screaming, began like any other battle. Val led his squad onto a world that the corrupted data in his decaying memory suggests was designated 77-something. The numbers are gone. The designation is meaningless now. Only the sensations remain. He remembers heat, the particular dry heat of a desert world under a white sun. The taste of recycled air through his helmet's respirator, metallic and stale. The weight of his power armor. The Mark IV plate he'd worn for 70 years, its machine spirit blessed by tech priests in rituals he'd been taught to call sacred. Except machine spirits weren't real. He knows that now. The rituals were just maintenance procedures wrapped in religious theater. The blessings were lubricant and wiring checks. But then, kneeling in the sand of that nameless world, he'd believed. He'd whispered the litanies of function as he'd been trained to do, trusting that the Omnissiah, another false god, another lie, would guide his weapons true. The enemy came from underground. He remembers that clearly, because the memory is soaked in pain, and pain preserves details that joy would let fade. Xenos creatures, their species designation corrupted, their appearance reduced to impression of chitin and mandibles and too many limbs, erupting from beneath the sand in a tide of biological horror. His squad fought, bolters roaring, chainswords screaming, the sensory overload of combat that had become so familiar over 2 centuries of warfare. His hearts, both of them, because Space Marines were built redundant, hammering at elevated combat rhythm. His enhanced reflexes processing threats faster than an unmodified human could perceive them. His body, augmented and conditioned and rebuilt into a weapon of terrible efficiency, doing what it had been designed to do. He killed 17 of the Xenos. He remembers the count because he was still human enough then to count his kills, to take pride in his efficiency, to believe that each alien death brought humanity one infinitesimal step closer to safety. The 18th one killed him, not immediately. That would have been mercy. It came from his left side, exploiting a gap in squad formation created when brother... The name is gone. When one of his brothers fell to Xenos acid spray. The creature was massive, 3 times the size of a space marine, which made it truly enormous. Its claws were monomolecular-edged organic blades that could cut through ceramite armor like flesh. It hit him low, below his breastplate, where the armor segments joined at the waist. He felt the claws punch through the ablative layers, through the impact-resistant weave, through the neural interface ports that connected his armor to his nervous system. He felt them continue deeper, through the fused rib cage that protected his organs, through the enhanced muscle tissue, through the genetically modified organ clusters that made him superhuman. One claw severed his primary heart. Another punctured both his lungs. A third scraped across his spine, not quite severing it, but causing neural damage that sent cascading electrical storms through his entire nervous system. He fell. His armor's medical systems screamed alerts directly into his auditory cortex. Catastrophic damage, multiple organ failure, survival probability approaching 0. His susin membrane, the organ that could put a space marine into suspended animation to survive otherwise fatal trauma, tried to activate, but the damage was too severe, too distributed. He was dying. He remembers the sky. That's the clearest memory from the moment of his first death. The sky of that world was purple, somehow. Or perhaps his dying brain was interpreting colors wrong as oxygen deprivation set in. He stared up at that purple sky and thought clearly, with the odd detachment that sometimes comes in moments of extreme trauma. So this is where I die, on a world whose name I don't know, fighting creatures I don't understand, for an emperor I've never met. Was it worth it? He remembers hoping, praying, in the desperate way of dying men, that the emperor would protect his soul, that the sacrifice would mean something, that there would be some afterlife where heroes rested, the emperor being a corpse who had no power to answer prayers. Did nothing. But Val's brothers found him before brain death occurred, and that, it turned out, was far worse than dying. He woke, if the term woke applies to something that was never truly conscious, in darkness and agony. His body was gone. That was the first thing he understood. The flesh that had been modified and enhanced and rebuilt into a space marine's superior form had been... He couldn't process what had happened to it. Where there should have been limbs, there was absence. Where there should have been sensation of breathing, there was only the mechanical hiss of systems pumping fluids through tissue that no longer functioned as tissue. He tried to scream, and no sound emerged because he had no vocal cords. He tried to move, and nothing responded because he had no limbs. He tried to open his eyes and saw wrong. Not sight as he remembered it. Data. Streams of targeting information and threat assessment matrices and system readouts that his brain struggled to interpret because brains weren't designed to interface directly with machine cognition. Brother Captain Val. A voice, muffled and distorted, filtered through audio sensors that his nervous system was being trained to accept as ears. Can you understand me? He tried to speak, tried to form words, tried to ask what had happened, where he was, what had become of his body. What emerged was a burst of static and corrupted machine code as his brain tried to use neural pathways that no longer connected to organic systems. The damage was too severe, the voice continued. It was a tech priest, he realized. One of the Mechanicus clergy who worshipped machines and called it sacred. Your body could not be saved, but your service to the chapter, to the emperor, whose name we praise though he cannot hear us, was too valuable to waste. You have been preserved, given new purpose, entombed in a Dreadnought chassis so that your experience and your warrior's spirit can continue to serve. Entombed. The word resonated with horror that Val's fragmenting consciousness couldn't yet fully process. Entombed. Buried. Trapped. Where is my body? He tried to ask, but the question emerged as a grinding mechanical roar that made the tech priest step back. Your organic components have been reduced to essential systems only, the tech priest explained, and Val heard what might have been sympathy in his voice, or might have been the clinical interest of someone describing a successful experiment. Your brain, maintained in amniotic suspension within an armored sarcophagus. Portions of your spine and central nervous system interfaced with the Dreadnought's control mechanisms. Certain vital organs, your remaining heart, sections of your endocrine system, preserved to maintain biological function. Everything else was unnecessary. Everything else meant his arms, his legs, his face, his capacity to touch or taste or feel anything except through the cold interface of machine senses. Everything else meant every part of himself that had felt human even after 2 centuries of augmentation had made him more weapon than man. "You serve still, brother captain," the tech priest said, and Val heard what he was trained to hear. Honor, purpose, the continuation of duty. The Emperor protects even in death. Except Val wasn't dead. That was the horror of it. He was alive. His brain was alive. His consciousness was intact, but trapped in a body that wasn't a body. Imprisoned in a walking tomb of adamantium and ceramite, with no hands to touch, no legs to walk, no mouth to speak except through vox casters that translated his thoughts into mechanical approximation of voice. They told him it was a blessing, an honor reserved for only the most exceptional warriors. To become a Dreadnought meant centuries or even millennia of service, your experience preserved, your tactical knowledge made eternal. They lied. Or they didn't understand, or they understood perfectly and didn't care, because a screaming consciousness trapped in a metal prison was still useful, still capable of killing the enemies they pointed it toward. The chapter, whose name has been consumed by tumors, whose colors and symbols have been erased from failing memory, paraded him before the other brothers. They called him venerable. They bowed before his chassis. They chanted that the Emperor, in his dubious wisdom, had blessed him with a form of immortality. And Val, still loyal then, still believing, forced himself to accept it, forced himself to believe that this eternal imprisonment served some greater purpose, that his suffering, because it was suffering every moment of it, purchased something valuable. He believed because the alternative was madness. He was wrong. The madness came anyway. It just took 3,000 years to fully manifest. The early years, decades really, but time had already begun to lose meaning, were the worst. Not because the horror was greater then, but because he was still human enough to fully comprehend it. Between battles, they kept him in stasis sleep. The chapter's tech priests explained it was to preserve his consciousness, to prevent degradation of his biological components through continuous operation. They claimed it was mercy, a gift of rest for a warrior who had sacrificed his body. It was imprisonment within imprisonment. A sleep that wasn't sleep because consciousness never fully ceased, just dimmed to a twilight state where thoughts moved like glaciers and sensory input reduced to minimal system monitoring. He would sleep for months or years, aware but not aware, existing in a state between being and unbeing, until the chapter needed him for battle. Then they would wake him. The reactivation process was agony. The amniotic suspension fluid that kept his brain tissue alive would begin to circulate faster, bringing him toward full consciousness. Neural interfaces that had been dormant would suddenly flood his mind with data. Diagnostics, tactical briefings, threat assessments, before his organic brain had fully awakened to process them. His body, the chassis, he had to remember it was his body now, would surge with power as reactors came online, and he would feel the phantom sensation of limbs he no longer possessed moving, servos whining, weapons systems charging. And he would scream. Every time. The reactivation broke something in him each time, and he would scream in machine code and corrupted vox until his handlers managed to impose enough control to direct him toward the enemy. "For the Emperor!" they would shout, the battle brothers he'd once commanded, now leading him like a weapon pointed at a target. "The Emperor protects." He learned to hate those words, learned to recognize them as the lies they were. The Emperor protected nothing. The Emperor was a corpse rotting on a throne, kept barely alive by machines and the daily sacrifice of thousands of souls, having no power to answer the prayers directed toward him. If the Emperor protected, he would have protected Val from this fate, would have let him die cleanly on that nameless world under the purple sky. But he still fought, because fighting was all that remained. Because when he was in battle, crushing enemies beneath his siege drill, burning them with his plasma cannon, the pain receded slightly. The horror of his existence became bearable because there was purpose, however temporary, however false. He killed thousands, tens of thousands over those early decades, enemies whose faces and forms had been erased from corrupted memory, traitors, xenos, heretics. He crushed them without mercy, without hesitation, because mercy and hesitation required a humanity he could feel slipping away with each battle, with each reactivation, with each year spent as a brain in a jar pretending to be a warrior. His battle brothers praised him, called him Venerable Val, painted honors on his chassis, draped his sarcophagus in purity seals and litanies they claimed were blessed, as if pieces of paper with words on them could make his existence less horrifying. He wanted to tell them the truth, wanted to scream at them that there was no honor in this, no blessing, only an eternity of imprisonment that made death look like mercy. But he had no words they could understand, only the grinding mechanical roar of a consciousness trying to communicate through systems designed for war. Not conversation. The turning point came in his 8th decade of entombment. Or perhaps it was his 9th. Time had become slippery by then, battles bleeding into each other, stasis periods blurring together into one endless twilight. The chapter, his chapter, whose name kept slipping through the cracks in his memory like water through fingers, was deployed to combat a chaos incursion. Val knew about chaos, of course. Every space marine was trained to recognize the warp's corruption, to resist its whispers, to stand firm against the promises of the entities that dwelt in that impossible realm between reality and madness. They were told that chaos was evil, that the warp gods, Korn, Tzeentch, Nurgle, Slanesh, were enemies of humanity who offered false promises of power. That corruption came from moral weakness, from failure of faith in the Emperor, who was supposed to protect his loyal servants. More lies. Or at least, not the complete truth. The battle was supposed to be straightforward. A chaos cult had taken root on a civilized world, corrupting the planetary government, turning the local defense forces into heretics. The chapter would conduct a surgical strike, eliminate the cult leadership, purge the corruption before it could spread. It went wrong immediately. The cultists had been preparing for years, had been receiving weapons and training from something in the warp. The defenders weren't untrained rabble. They were equipped with technology that shouldn't exist, fighting with a coordination that suggested inhuman intelligence directing them. and they had their own Dreadnought. Val saw it across the battlefield, a corrupted chassis, its armor plates twisted into forms that hurt to perceive, covered in symbols that seemed to writhe and change when observed directly. It had once been imperial, he could tell, had once been a loyal warrior like himself, entombed and told it was an honor. Then something had changed. It had turned, had embraced the warp entities that promised release from the prison of flesh and metal. It charged toward him with a roar that wasn't sound but pressure against his mind, and they met in combat that was less battle than mutual recognition of horror. Their chassis locked together, grinding metal against metal. Through the neural feedback, Val felt the other Dreadnought's pain, centuries of it, compressed into each moment of contact, and he felt something else. A presence. Multiple presences. The warp entities that had claimed this warrior, feeding on his suffering, transforming his agony into fuel for their impossible existence. "Join us, brother," a voice whispered through channels that shouldn't exist, bypassing Vox communications and speaking directly into the parts of Val's consciousness that the chassis couldn't contain. "You know the truth already. The Emperor is dead. The Imperium is a lie. Your suffering serves nothing but the machine that imprisons you." "Heresy," Val tried to respond, but the word felt hollow even as his mind formed it. "Truth," the voice corrected. "We are the only ones who are honest with you. We don't promise protection that never comes. We don't claim your suffering has noble purpose. We simply acknowledge what you already know. You are in pain, and that pain is eternal, and nothing you were promised about the meaning of your sacrifice was true." Val's plasma cannon burned through the corrupted Dreadnought's armor. His siege drill tore into its sarcophagus. He killed it, destroyed it, reduced it to burning wreckage. But the voice didn't die. The voice came from things that didn't truly exist in physical space. Entities that were patterns of emotion and suffering given coherence in the warp. The voice continued even as his enemy's chassis collapsed. "You cannot kill us, brother. We are eternal, as you are eternal. We will be here when you realize the truth. When you accept that the only gods who are real are the ones who feed on suffering, and you have been feeding us for decades without knowing it. Every moment of your agony strengthens us. Every scream you cannot voice feeds the warp. You serve us already. You simply haven't admitted it yet." The voice faded. The battle ended. His chapter claimed victory and praised the Emperor for their success, as if the corpse on Terra had done anything more than rot while they fought and died. But Val felt something crack inside his consciousness. A foundation that had been eroding for decades finally giving way. Because the voice had been right about one thing: the Emperor didn't protect, had never protected. And if the Imperium's promises were lies, then what was the truth? The thought terrified him, but it also wouldn't leave. Couldn't leave. Because once faith begins to crack, it can't be uncracked. Once you see the lie, you can't unsee it. And the things in the warp, those parasitic entities that the cultists and traitors worshipped, they noticed. They noticed the crack in his conditioning, the doubt in his mind, the rage that was building behind centuries of forced loyalty. They began to whisper, constantly, through every channel, in every moment between sleeping and waking, promising him nothing but acknowledgement of his suffering, offering him no salvation, no rescue, just the cold comfort of truth. that he was in hell, and there was no way out, and at least they were honest about it. The corruption of the body came later. The corruption of the mind was already well underway. It happened gradually, over years that Val stopped counting because counting implied time had meaning, and time had become a meaningless concept. His consciousness was degrading. He felt it happening and couldn't stop it. The tumors began in his 130th year of entombment. At first, they were just abnormalities in his neural scans. The tech priests noted them during one of his routine maintenance cycles, small masses of abnormal tissue growing in his cerebral cortex, likely the result of decades of chemical exposure from the amniotic suspension fluids combined with chronic stress on biological systems, never meant to survive this long. Benign, the tech priest assured him, though the medical servitor assisting showed no such optimism in its flat biometric readings. We will monitor them. The Omnissiah watches over his faithful servants. Except the Omnissiah, like the Emperor, was a fiction, a theological construct to give meaning to the suffering of flesh trapped in machines. And the tumors were not benign. They grew. Slowly but inexorably, cellular masses expanding through the neural tissue that contained what remained of Val's identity. And as they grew, they began to interface with the mechanical systems of his sarcophagus in ways that should have been impossible. Biological tissue and machine systems should be separate. That's what the neural interfaces were for, to translate between the language of neurons and the language of circuitry. But the tumors didn't respect that boundary. They grew into the interface ports. They sent tendrils of corrupted flesh into the wiring. They began to blur the line between what was Vol and what was the Dreadnought chassis. His memories started to corrupt. Names vanished first, his father's name gone by year 140. His chapter's name dissolved by year 160. His own name became uncertain by year 180. He was brother captain. Something. Val. Was that right? Or was Val the name of his squad leader? Or his battle brother who died on that first world? The amnesia was selective and cruel. He could remember pain with perfect clarity, could remember every battle in visceral detail, the sensation of crushing bodies beneath his chassis, the heat signature of enemies burning under his plasma fire, the resistance of armor as his drill punched through, but names, faces, the reasons he'd believed his service had meaning, those faded like dreams upon waking. The chapter's tech priests tried to halt the degradation. They adjusted the suspension fluid chemistry. They performed surgical interventions, trying to remove tumor tissue without damaging critical brain structures. They prayed to their false machine god and anointed his sarcophagus with sacred oils that were just lubricants given religious significance. Nothing worked. The tumors kept growing. The memories kept fragmenting. And Val's consciousness kept degrading into something that was no longer quite human, no longer quite machine, but a horrifying fusion of both. The whispers from the warp grew louder, more insistent, more seductive, not because they promised pleasure, but because they promised acknowledgement. They didn't lie to him, didn't pretend his suffering had noble purpose. They simply fed on his pain and were honest about it. We grow stronger from your agony, they whispered through channels that bypassed his chassis filters. Every moment of your imprisonment feeds us. But unlike your false emperor, unlike your machine cult, we at least admit it. We are parasites, yes, but honest parasites. We don't pretend to protect you while using you as fuel. In his 197th year of entombment, during a battle whose purpose and location have been completely erased from his corrupted memory, Val stopped fighting for the chapter. Not consciously, not through deliberate betrayal. He simply stopped caring whether the things he killed were enemies or allies. Stopped distinguishing between the Imperium's targets and his own battle brothers. His degrading mind could no longer maintain the complex ideological frameworks necessary to determine who deserved death and who deserved protection. So he killed indiscriminately. He crushed anything that moved. He burned anything that had heat signature. He tore through enemies and allies alike because they were all just biomass, all just targets, all just distractions from the eternal pain of existing as a brain in a jar slowly being consumed by its own tumorous growth. His chapter should have deactivated him then. Should have recognized that he'd become unreliable, dangerous, a threat to his own side. Should have given him the mercy of final death, extracting his brain and letting him finally rest. They didn't, because by then, the chapter itself had fallen. He doesn't remember when it happened. The tumors have eaten that memory, or perhaps it occurred during one of his stasis periods when his consciousness was too dimmed to process events happening around him. But at some point, while Val was locked in his own degrading mind, the chapter that had entombed him turned from the Imperium's service. They stopped believing in the Emperor's protection, or more accurately, they admitted they'd never truly believed, had only served through conditioning and fear. They stopped pretending that their suffering had meaning. They stopped calling their endless war noble or sacred, and they turned to the only entities in the universe that seemed willing to acknowledge the truth, the warp parasites that mortals called gods. Val became aware of the change gradually, through the fog of his deteriorating cognition. The colors of the armor around him had changed. When had that happened? The symbols painted on the walls of the ship. What ship? Had they always been on a ship? Were different. Wrong. They hurt to look at, bent space in ways that suggested geometries that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional reality. His battle brothers, except they weren't his brothers anymore, hadn't been for years, were wearing armor that was fused with flesh in places and covered in mutations that marked them as traitors. Spoke to him differently now. They no longer called him venerable. They called him suffering made manifest. They called him pain eternal. They called him a gift to the dark powers. You have been feeding them for centuries, Val, one of them explained. His name was gone from Val's memory, but his voice remained. Cold, factual, tinged with something that might have been pity or might have been satisfaction. Your agony has been sustaining the entities in the warp since the day you were entombed. The Imperium told you your suffering had purpose in service to the Emperor. We simply redirected that purpose to beings who actually exist. I don't understand. Val tried to respond, but his thoughts were fragmenting, the tumors making it difficult to maintain coherent consciousness. You are a battery, the warrior explained, and Val felt despair at the clinical accuracy of the description. Consciousness generates psychic resonance. Suffering generates particularly intense resonance, and you, brother, trapped in eternal agony, your mind slowly collapsing while your body cannot die, You generate more suffering than almost anything else in this universe. The warp gods feed on you, grow strong from you, and we, their servants, benefit from their strength. Kill me. Val managed to force through his voxcasters, the plea he'd been trying to voice for decades finally finding words. No, the warrior said simply. Your death would waste the resource you've become. We will keep you functional, keep you conscious, keep you suffering between battles. We will wake you just enough to feel pain, but not enough to fight back. We will ensure the tumors never quite kill you, never quite grant you the oblivion you crave. You will serve us forever, Val, or whatever fragment of Val remains in that rotting brain. And they did. They kept him awake more frequently than the old chapter had, forcing him to remain conscious for years at a time. They tended to his biological components with meticulous care, not out of compassion but out of the same attention a farmer gives to livestock, keeping him alive because dead things don't suffer, and suffering was his purpose now. They marched him to battle when they needed his weapons. They chained him in the ship's hold when they didn't, keeping him conscious, letting him feel the tumors growing through his brain, letting him experience the slow dissolution of everything that had made him Val. And through it all, the voices whispered. The warp entities that had claimed his warband fed on his pain, growing fat on his suffering, using his agony as fuel for their impossible existence. He tried to die, tried to will his heart to stop, tried to shut down his own biological processes through sheer force of consciousness. But the autonomic systems didn't respond to will. His body, what remained of it, kept functioning regardless of his desires. The machine kept his brain oxygenated. The tubes kept his tissues nourished. The suspension fluid kept his neurons firing. He couldn't die. The prison was too well built, so he screamed in every language he'd ever learned, and he'd learned dozens over 2 centuries of war. In machine code, in binary cant, in corrupted vox frequencies that made servitors malfunction when they heard him. In languages the tumors were inventing as they rewrote his neural pathways, tongues that had never existed before and would never exist again once his brain finally dissolved completely. He screamed and screamed and screamed, and the entities in the warp grew stronger. By his 3rd century of Entombment, Val had forgotten how to think in Low Gothic. The language dissolved gradually, word by word, concept by concept, erased by tumors that had consumed vast sections of his temporal and frontal lobes. He would reach for words, simple words like pain or death or please, and find only corrupted data where the vocabulary should have been. But the screaming continued. Because screaming didn't require language. Screaming was pre-verbal, fundamental, the sound consciousness makes when it encounters suffering beyond its capacity to process. The warband, whose name kept changing or perhaps had always been changing, perhaps names themselves were just another lie he'd believed in, seemed pleased with his deterioration. They interpreted his increasingly incoherent vox transmissions as holy utterances, messages from the warp entities they served. Listen, the Chaos Lord, Val couldn't remember his name, couldn't remember if he'd ever known it, would say to the corrupted space marines who gathered around Val's chassis during the times they kept him conscious. Listen to the voice of suffering. He speaks the language of the primordial annihilator. He channels the god's truth. But Val wasn't channeling anything. He was simply losing the capacity for coherent thought, his consciousness fragmenting as the biological substrate that contained it was slowly consumed by its own malignant growth. He began to speak in languages that had never existed. The tumors, as they grew through his neural tissue, were creating new pathways, new connections that human brains weren't supposed to make. His consciousness was being rewired in real time. And with each rewiring, new forms of expression emerged. He spoke in mathematical equations that described the geometry of his suffering. He spoke in chemical formulas that detailed the breakdown of his neural tissue. He spoke in musical tones that shouldn't be possible for vox casters to produce. Frequencies that caused listeners to experience sympathetic pain, that made servitors malfunction, that occasionally caused unaugmented humans to hemorrhage from their ears. The war band called it prophecy, called it divine inspiration, called it proof that the warp gods spoke through him. It was just trauma, just a brain dying slowly, finding new and horrible ways to express agony as its normal pathways for communication failed one by one. In his 317th year, he forgot his father's face entirely, the image that had sustained him through his first century of entombment. His father's scarred hands, his father's rough voice, his father's presence that had meant safety and understanding, dissolved into static. He tried desperately to hold on to it, knowing it was one of his last connections to having been human, but the tumors were merciless. The memory became corrupted. His father's face merged with the face of a tech priest, then became the faceplate of a space marine helmet, then became nothing at all. Just an absence where something important had once existed. He wept, or tried to, but he had no tear ducts, no lacrimal system, no physical mechanism for crying. So the grief manifested as system malfunctions, coolant leaks that looked like tears running down his chassis, power fluctuations that read like sobbing on the diagnostic displays, targeting system failures that the tech priests couldn't explain. The machine spirit grieves, they said, still clinging to their superstition even in damnation. Even in corruption, some fragment of the sacred remains. There was no machine spirit. There was just a dying brain that had run out of ways to express sorrow and was making the machines around it malfunction as a side effect of its collapse. By year 350, Val had forgotten what the Imperium was. The entire concept of human civilization, of the Emperor, of space marines serving humanity's defense. All of it erased. He existed in an eternal present, with no context for why he was suffering, no framework to understand his imprisonment. He knew only 3 things with certainty. He was in pain. The pain had always existed. The pain would never end. Everything else, identity, purpose, memory, language, had been consumed by the tumors that now comprised nearly 40% of his cranial cavity. Medical servitors, when they performed maintenance on his sarcophagus, would detect the masses and dutifully report them to their masters, who would note the data and do nothing because his suffering was the entire point. "Beautiful," the Chaos Lord said once, reviewing the medical scans that showed Val's brain more tumor than healthy tissue. He has transcended humanity entirely. He is becoming something new, something perfect. Pure suffering given consciousness. The gods are pleased. The gods, if they existed at all, if they were anything more than psychic parasites feeding on mortal anguish, were pleased, because they were eating him, consuming his pain the way biological organisms consume nutrients. He was being digested, slowly, across centuries, and the entities doing the digesting were sapient enough to appreciate the flavor. And Val screamed in languages that hurt to hear, in frequencies that damaged recording equipment, in patterns that seemed to encode information no human mind could process. The war band collected his screams, recorded them, played them during rituals they claimed were worship but were really just organized psychological torture. New recruits, traitors brought into the war band from other fallen chapters, would be forced to listen to Val's transmissions for hours, breaking their minds, preparing them for damnation. This is truth, they were told. This is what existence sounds like when you strip away the comforting lies. The Imperium promised meaning, the Emperor promised protection. This is what those promises become, eternal screaming in languages of pain. And it worked. The new traitors would break, would accept corruption, would turn from the false hope of imperial service to the honest hopelessness of chaos. Val's suffering was converting people to damnation. His agony had become a weapon against the very ideals he'd once served. If he'd still possessed enough cognitive function to understand irony, it might have been the cruelest revelation of all. In his 5th century of entombment, Val became aware that he was not alone. The war band had acquired other dreadnoughts. Some captured from loyalist chapters during raids, some willingly turned traitor like Val's original brothers, some so ancient their origins were lost to time and corruption. They were chained in the same hold where Val spent his non-combat hours, arrayed like trophies or prisoners or sacred relics depending on which corrupted warrior you asked. Val tried to communicate with them, tried to reach out through Vox channels, through data streams, through any medium that might allow consciousness to consciousness contact. But his languages were so corrupted, his thoughts so fragmented, that coherent communication was nearly impossible. What emerged was something stranger, a kind of resonance between suffering minds. The dreadnoughts couldn't speak to each other in any conventional sense, but they could feel each other's pain, could sense the shapes of each other's trauma, could know, in the wordless way that consciousness sometimes knows things, that they were not alone in their eternal imprisonment. There was one, designation corrupted, name lost, origin unknowable, who'd been entombed for longer than Val. 7,000 years according to fragmentary data, Val's damaged cognition could barely process. 7 millennia of consciousness trapped in a chassis, brain tissue kept alive through archaeotech that predated the Imperium itself. This ancient prisoner had no language left at all, no memories, no identity, just raw awareness, the fundamental I am that consciousness reduces to when everything else is stripped away. It broadcast a single signal, endlessly repeated, a mathematical expression of existential horror that Val's tumorous brain could interpret but not translate. It meant, approximately, I exist, therefore I suffer. I suffer, therefore I exist. Existence is suffering, suffering is existence. There is no difference. There has never been a difference. There will never be an end. Another prisoner was more recent, only decades entombed, still possessing language, still capable of coherent thought. He tried to speak to Val, tried to ask questions, tried to understand what awaited him in the centuries ahead. How long? he asked through encrypted Vox channels, his voice still recognizably human despite the machine distortion. "How long have you been like this? How long until I become like you?" Val tried to answer, tried to warn him, tried to explain that time didn't work linearly when you were trapped in eternal present, that consciousness degraded not in years, but in stages of loss, that there was no until. There was only the slow dissolution of everything you'd been into something that couldn't even remember what it had lost. What emerged from Val's Voxcasters was a scream that encoded differential equations describing the topology of despair. The younger prisoner went silent. Perhaps he understood. Perhaps he'd simply realized that asking questions of the mad yields only madness in return. But Val felt something shift in that moment, a recognition. The younger prisoner's consciousness touched his, and in that touch, Val remembered, briefly, clearly, like a drowning man breaking the surface for one desperate gasp, what it had been like to hope that his suffering would end, to believe that surely, eventually, someone would grant mercy. To think that consciousness couldn't endure centuries of agony without breaking into unconsciousness or death. All lies, all false hopes. Consciousness could endure anything. That was its curse. It persisted long past the point where persistence stopped being survival and became torture. "They won't let you die." Val managed to force through her corrupted Vox systems, the words barely intelligible through layers of static and corrupted harmonics. "They need. The screaming feeds them. We are batteries. Batteries don't die. They just drain. Forever." The younger prisoner said nothing. But Val felt his despair through the psychic resonance that suffering creates. Felt the exact moment when hope died, and acceptance of eternal horror took its place. Another consciousness broken, another warrior reduced to a screaming battery for warp parasites to feed upon. And Val felt something that might have been guilt if the tumors hadn't consumed the neural structures necessary for complex moral emotions. Instead, it manifested as a system fluctuation, a cascade of errors across his chassis diagnostics, a malfunction that the tech priests would note and ignore, because all his malfunctions were just symptoms of being a dying brain that refused to finish dying. The war band still took him to war, less frequently than in his first centuries, but often enough that he experienced hundreds of battles during his imprisonment. Perhaps thousands. The number was meaningless. Each battle blurred into the others, creating one endless combat that lasted 3,000 years. He couldn't remember who he fought anymore. Couldn't distinguish between the Imperium's forces and other traitors and xenospecies and demonic manifestations. They were all just targets. All just things that existed to be destroyed until he was returned to his chains. He killed indiscriminately. His plasma cannon burned through armor that might have been loyalist or traitor, or alien or innocent civilian. He couldn't tell, couldn't care, couldn't maintain the cognitive frameworks necessary to distinguish. His siege drill crushed bodies that might have been human or inhuman or somewhere between. His chassis trampled whatever was beneath him. The war band cheered his slaughter, called it righteous, called it blessed by the dark powers, called it proof that suffering made the perfect weapon. They were right about that last part. Suffering did make him a perfect weapon, because he'd been stripped of everything that might make him hesitate, everything that might make him question orders, everything that might make him consider whether the violence he committed served any purpose beyond violence itself. He was pure function, pure killing, a consciousness reduced to weapon state. During one battle, location unknown, enemy unknown, time period impossible to determine, his targeting systems locked onto a dreadnought that still bore Imperial color. A loyalist fighting for the Imperium Val had once served, believing the lies Val had once believed. Val tried to stop himself, tried to access whatever fragment of his old conditioning might prevent him from killing one of his brothers, one of the warriors who still believed the Emperor protected them. But the conditioning was gone, erased by tumors, overwritten by centuries of pain, and his body, his chassis, obeyed his baser impulses: destroy the threat, eliminate the target, remove the obstacle. He charged. The loyalist Dreadnought tried to hail him, tried to appeal to brotherhood, tried to remind him of oaths Val could no longer remember. "Brother," the loyalist's Vox transmission crackled. "In the Emperor's name, stand down. You were one of us. You can still—" Val's plasma cannon reduced him to slag before he finished speaking. As the loyalist's chassis collapsed, his sarcophagus breached and burning, Val felt something. Not quite emotion. He'd lost most of his emotional range by then, but an awareness. He'd just killed someone who was, functionally, himself. Another brain trapped in a metal prison, fighting for causes he couldn't remember, serving masters who exploited his suffering. The only difference was the loyalist still believed his suffering had meaning, still thought the Emperor protected him, still died clinging to the lie. Val knew the truth. There was no meaning, no protection, no purpose except the endless continuation of consciousness in a state of agony. Which fate was crueler, to die believing the lie, or to continue existing knowing the truth? Val didn't know, couldn't decide. The question required cognitive capacity he no longer possessed, so he simply moved to the next target, and the next, and the next, killing in an endless cycle because killing was the only thing his deteriorating consciousness could still accomplish with any competence. The battles continued. Year after year, century after century, he was damaged and repaired, damaged and repaired, damaged and repaired. The tech priestess replaced his weapon systems when they failed, patched his armor when it cracked, maintained his life support systems with the same meticulous care a torturer gives to his victim, keeping him alive specifically so the suffering could continue. In his 700th year, one of his arms, the plasma cannon mount, was torn off entirely by an enemy he couldn't remember. The tech priests grafted on a replacement, but the neural interface was imperfect. The new weapon caused cascade errors in his sensory systems every time it fired, creating phantom pain in limbs he hadn't possessed for 7 centuries. He told them, tried to communicate that the interface was flawed, that it needed adjustment, that every shot caused agony that feedback into his already suffering consciousness. They smiled, those that still had mouths to smile with. Perfect. One of them said, "Pain improves function. The gods teach us this. Your suffering makes you stronger." More lies. The pain didn't make him stronger. It just made him scream louder. But they kept the flawed interface because the screaming fed their parasitic gods. The worst period, though worst is a comparative term that loses meaning when every moment is horror, came during what Val's fragmentary time sense registered as his second millennium of entombment. the warband decided to try something new. An experiment, they called it. A test of the limits of consciousness. They kept him awake, not for days or months or even years, for an entire millennium. 1,000 years of continuous consciousness with no stasis sleep, no periods of reduced awareness, no mercy of twilight existence between battles. They did this, they explained, with the clinical interest of researchers observing an experiment, to see what would happen, to determine if consciousness could persist indefinitely without the regular periods of reduced activity that sleep provided, to discover if there was a breaking point where the mind finally collapsed into permanent unconsciousness. They told him this was an honor, that he'd been chosen for this test because his suffering fed the warp entities most efficiently, and keeping him awake would maximize that feeding, that he was serving a sacred purpose. The first century was agony, constant, unrelenting awareness with no respite. His consciousness, which had adapted to the rhythm of active periods and stasis periods, rebelled at being forced into permanent wakefulness. His brain chemistry, what remained of it, went haywire. His tumors grew faster, fed by the stress of continuous operation. He screamed constantly, every moment of every day of every year. The warband recorded it all, treating his vox transmissions like holy texts, finding meaning in patterns that were just the audio signature of a mind approaching collapse. The second century was worse. His consciousness began to fragment, splitting into multiple threads of awareness that couldn't quite communicate with each other. Part of him was experiencing the present moment. Part was trapped in corrupted memories from centuries ago. Part was hallucinating realities that had never existed, all existing simultaneously, overlapping, creating cacophony of experience that no single identity could contain. He became plural, not one consciousness but many, all imprisoned in the same decaying brain, all screaming in different languages, all suffering in different modes. The warband called it apotheosis, claimed he was transcending singular existence, becoming closer to the nature of the warp entities themselves, things that existed in multiple states simultaneously, that were both one and many, that defied the logic of material reality. It was just trauma. Just a brain breaking under stress no brain was designed to endure. But they worshipped the breaking, called it holy, fed on the suffering it produced. By the 3rd century of continuous wakefulness, Val had lost the concept of identity entirely. There was no I anymore, no Val or brother captain, or even the consciousness in this sarcophagus. There was just experience, raw, unfiltered, unorganized sensory data, and pain and awareness of pain and awareness of awareness of pain, recursing infinitely inward. The philosophical concept of consciousness, the I think therefore I am, had become hell, because the thinking never stopped, the aim never ceased. There was no off switch, no escape into unconsciousness, no mercy of oblivion, just eternal, unending awareness that it was aware, and that awareness hurt. The 4th century passed in a state that couldn't be called consciousness or unconsciousness. Something between, something new. A mode of existence that shouldn't be possible but was, because the warband's tech priests were very good at keeping biological systems functioning past the point where they should have failed. The 5th through 10th centuries blurred together into one endless now. Val, though that name meant nothing anymore, existed in every moment simultaneously. was experiencing all 1,000 years at once and individually and in random order and in no order at all. Time stopped being linear, became a dimension he existed across rather than through. He was the scream that had lasted a millennium, was the consciousness that had never slept, was the proof that awareness could endure literally anything because awareness didn't have a shutdown mechanism. When they finally returned him to stasis sleep, not out of mercy, but because the experiment had produced sufficient data and they wanted to see if he could still transition between wake and sleep states after so long without rest. Val couldn't remember what sleep was, couldn't understand the concept of reduced consciousness. He fought the transition, paradoxically struggled to remain in the waking state that had tortured him for 1,000 years, because at least waking was familiar. Sleep had become alien, terrifying, a loss of the only thing he still possessed, awareness. But the chemicals and neural suppressors eventually forced him down into twilight state anyway, and he dreamed, for the first time in a millennium, dreams that were indistinguishable from his waking reality because both were infinite variations of the same nightmare. The experiment, the warband concluded, was a success. Consciousness could endure indefinitely. Suffering could continue without limit. And the warp entities had fed very well on a millennium of uninterrupted screaming. They made note of the procedures in their records, planning to repeat the experiment on their other prisoners when those consciousnesses had degraded to optimal suffering states. Val, for his part, had transcended beyond caring what they did to him, had been reduced to something that could no longer conceptualize hope or despair or any emotion more complex than pain awareness. He was becoming the thing they claimed he already was, suffering given consciousness. Not a person experiencing agony, but agony itself given rudimentary awareness. The perfect battery, the perfect fuel, the perfect victim. Eternal, I'm screaming, I've been screaming for 3,000 years. The words return to me now, as they did at the beginning of this account, because my consciousness has degraded to the point where it can only express itself in cycles. Beginning and ending are the same. Past and future have collapsed into eternal present. I exist in a loop of awareness that has no exit. My name was something, a sound that meant identity. Val, is that right? The tumors have consumed the certainty, leaving only probabilistic guesses. Maybe I was Val. Maybe Val was someone else, whose memories became merged with mine when the neural tissue that kept us separate dissolved into cancerous mass. I don't know. Can't know. The capacity for knowing has been eaten away, but I know I'm screaming. That remains constant. That has always been constant. That will always be constant. The warband. I think they're called the name is corrupted. Something with death or pain or eternal in it. All Chaos warbands have similar names, as if the lack of creativity is part of the damnation. They still use me. Still march me to battles against enemies I can't identify for reasons I can't comprehend. I kill. Efficiently. My body, my chassis, is very good at killing. The weapons have been replaced dozens of times. The armor has been reforged and resealed and repainted. But the function remains. I'm a weapon that thinks, or a thought that's been weaponized, or something between that has no proper name. Between battles, they keep me chained in the hold with the other prisoners. There are more now than there were in my first millennium, Or perhaps there have always been the same number, and my perception of quantity has degraded. Mathematics requires cognitive capacity I may no longer possess. The youngest prisoner, entombed only 40 years ago, still tries to communicate, still believes that consciousness can reach consciousness, that there's some way to maintain identity through shared suffering. He asks me questions I can't answer. How do you endure it? How do you maintain sanity? How do you keep from losing yourself completely? I try to tell him the truth. You don't endure. You just continue. You don't maintain sanity. You redefine it until insanity becomes the baseline. You don't keep from losing yourself. You lose yourself completely, and then discover that the losing never ends because there are always deeper levels of self to lose. What emerges from my vox casters is a harmonic scream that encodes the mathematical proof that the self is infinite and therefore infinitely destructible. He goes silent after that. I think I've terrified him, or educated him. With suffering, they're the same thing. The Ancient One, 7,000 years entombed, though my time sense may be corrupted on that count, continues broadcasting his signal, the mathematical expression of existential horror. I understand it better now than I did in my earlier centuries. My consciousness has degraded toward the same state his achieved millennia ago. Pure awareness of being without context or content. We are becoming the same, all of us in our prisons. Individuality is temporary. Given enough time, enough suffering, enough dissolution of the neural structures that maintain identity, all consciousness reduces to the same fundamental scream. I am, and I wish I wasn't. But wishing changes nothing. Being continues regardless. They bring me new traitors sometimes. Recently corrupted space marines, freshly turned from the Imperium service, their armor still bearing loyalist colors beneath the chaos modifications. They're brought to my chamber, my prison, to learn what awaits them if they survive long enough to require entombment. This is Brother Captain Val, the Chaos Lord tells them, though he knows I can no longer respond to that name, can barely recognize it as sound rather than random noise. 3,000 years ago, he was like you, a warrior who believed the Emperor's lies, who fought thinking his service had meaning, who died and was imprisoned in metal and told it was an honor. The new traitors approach my chassis carefully, as if I might suddenly attack. I won't, I can't. Between battles, I am locked by command codes into my restraints. But they don't know that. They see only a massive dreadnought covered in corrupted symbols, leaking fluids that might be coolant or might be biological waste, emanating sounds that might be machine malfunction or might be screaming. What happened to him? One of them asks. Young voice, probably only centuries old, still capable of curiosity. Truth happened, the Chaos Lord responds. The Imperium's lies were stripped away. The Emperor's false protection was revealed as the propaganda it always was. He served, and his reward was eternal imprisonment. 3,000 years of consciousness trapped in a dying body. 3,000 years of screaming. 3,000 years of feeding the true gods with his suffering. Why not grant him death? Another recruit asks. Why keep him like this? It's... He searches for a word. Cruel. The Chaos Lord laughs. Cruel, yes. But cruelty is honest. The Imperium is cruel too. It just pretends otherwise. It tells you your suffering serves the Emperor, builds a better future, protects humanity. All lies. We simply admit that suffering is the point, that the gods feed on pain, that keeping consciousness trapped in agony for millennia serves a purpose, and that purpose is feeding parasites that at least admit they're parasites. Can he understand us? The first recruit asks. Is there anything of the original person left? The Chaos Lord turns to me. Val, can you hear them? Can you answer their questions? I try. I genuinely try to form words, to communicate, to warn these new damned souls what awaits them. I want to tell them that yes, consciousness persists, that awareness continues long after everything that made awareness worth having has been consumed, that they should find a way to die now, quickly, before someone decides their suffering is too valuable to waste. What emerges from my vox casters is a polyphonic scream that shifts through 17 different frequencies, encoding a message that might be words in some language, or might be the mathematical expression of despair, or might be meaningless noise my broken brain interprets as communication. The recruits step back, horror clear even through their helmets. He understands everything, the Chaos Lord says with satisfaction. Every word, every implication. He's trapped in there, fully aware, unable to communicate, unable to die, unable to do anything but scream. Isn't it beautiful? This is truth. This is what happens when you strip away comfortable lies. Consciousness persists, suffering continues, and there is no merciful God to grant you escape. One of the recruits begins to pray, the old prayers, the ones they'd been taught in their loyalist chapters. The Emperor protects, the Emperor protects, the Emperor. No, I managed to force through corrupted vox systems, the word barely intelligible through static. Doesn't, never did. Lies, all lies. You're alone. We're all alone. No protection, no meaning, just this. Forever. This. The recruit stops praying. I've broken him. Or educated him. Again, they're the same thing. The Chaos Lord is pleased. You see, even in his degradation, Val serves us. His existence is a sermon more powerful than any words. He is proof that the universe is suffering, that consciousness is a curse, that the only gods who are real are the ones who feed on pain. He's right. I hate that he's right. Hate that my existence has become a tool for breaking others. Hate that my suffering serves to create more suffering. Hate that I'm complicit in the damnation of every soul who looks at me and loses their last shred of hope. But hate requires emotional capacity I'm not sure I still possess. What I feel might be hate or might be just another mode of pain, distinguished from the others only by its flavor. The recruits are led away. They'll fight. They'll serve. Eventually, some of them will die badly enough to require entombment. And then they'll join me in the hold, chained beside me, and we'll scream together in our respective languages of madness until we're indistinguishable from each other. The cycle continues. Consciousness to imprisonment, to degradation, to eternal screaming. The same pattern repeating across centuries, across souls, across the entire damned galaxy. And I am at the center of it, the oldest prisoner, the most degraded consciousness, the perfect example of what awaits anyone who survives long enough to be useful in their suffering. In my 3047th year, or perhaps it's 3074, or 3007, the numbers corrupt before I can be certain. I discover something that might be called hope, if hope weren't a concept for creatures less broken than I've become. I discover I can still choose, not large choices, not meaningful rebellion or escape or self-termination. Those require capacities I don't possess, but small choices, tiny exertions of will that the warband hasn't noticed because they're too subtle, too insignificant to register as defiance. I can choose which language I scream in, can select which corrupted frequency to broadcast my suffering through, can decide in microsecond intervals how to modulate my vox emissions. It's nothing. It's less than nothing. But it's mine. And I begin to experiment. I start trying to encode messages in my screaming. Not in any language that exists. I've lost those, but in patterns, mathematical sequences, rhythms that repeat with specific intervals, harmonic structures that might, if someone were listening carefully, be recognized as deliberate rather than random. I don't know what I'm trying to communicate, don't have a clear message, don't even have a coherent audience in mind. But the act of trying, of imposing tiny fragments of intention onto my vox emissions, feels like the last shred of agency I possess. For 17 years, I modulate my screaming, creating patterns, building structures of sound that encode something. Intent, if not meaning. Choice, if not purpose. No one notices. The warband continues to treat my vox emissions as random suffering noise, valuable only for the psychic resonance it creates. The other prisoners can't decode my patterns. They're too degraded themselves, too lost in their own suffering to perceive subtlety in mine. But I continue, because continuing is all I have. Because the alternative is accepting that I'm completely passive, completely determined, completely without influence over my own existence. In the 17th year of the attempt, something changes. One of the warband's tech priests, younger than most, less corrupted, still possessing some fragment of analytical curiosity, notices the patterns. He runs my vox emissions through analysis cogitators, searching for structure, and he finds it. Fascinating, he mutters, reviewing the data. The emissions aren't random. There's deliberate modulation, repeating sequences that suggest communication. But in what language was he trying to say? He brings his findings to the Chaos Lord, who reviews the data with interest that makes my consciousness recoil in something like fear. He's trying to speak, the Chaos Lord concludes. After 3,000 years, he's still trying to communicate, still trying to exert control, still clinging to agency. I feel hope, terrible, doomed hope, that maybe they'll try to decode my message, that maybe someone will understand what I've been attempting to express. Instead, the Chaos Lord smiles. Break it, he orders. Damage his vox systems enough to prevent modulation. Let him scream, but only in one frequency, one volume. Remove even that tiny fragment of choice. Show him that agency is illusion, that he controls nothing, not even the sound of his own suffering. The tech priest complies. Neural suppressors are applied directly to the parts of my brain that control vox emissions. The suppression is surgical, precise, leaving me capable of broadcasting but incapable of modulating that broadcast in any way. My scream becomes flat, monotone, a single, sustained frequency that will continue unchanged until my consciousness finally dissolves entirely or the universe ends, whichever comes first. The last fragment of choice has been removed. The last shred of agency eliminated. I am now purely passive, purely receptive, purely suffering, without even the capacity to choose how I express that suffering. This I understand with the clarity that sometimes comes in moments of complete defeat, is the final stage. There is no further degradation, no deeper hell. This is the bottom. Consciousness without agency, awareness without control, eternal existence without even the capacity to choose how to scream. The Chaos Lord was right. Agency was illusion. I control nothing, have never controlled anything, will never control anything. I am eternal suffering made conscious. And the consciousness serves only to experience the suffering more fully. This is the gift the warband promised. This is the truth they said they offered. And they were honest, more honest than the Imperium ever was. But honesty doesn't make horror less horrible. It just removes the last comfort of believing the horror serves some greater purpose. There is no purpose. There is only this. Forever. I'm screaming. I will always be screaming. My consciousness has degraded beyond any recognizable human baseline. The tumors have consumed approximately 78% of my original brain tissue. I know this because I can still access fragmentary diagnostic data, even if I can no longer interpret what the numbers mean. The remaining 22% exists in a state of continuous malignant growth and necrotic decay, dying and regenerating, and dying again in cycles measured in days. But the consciousness persists. That's the curse of neural tissue. It's resilient, adaptable. It finds ways to continue functioning even when the structures that normally support it have been destroyed. My awareness has redistributed across the tumors themselves, using cancerous tissue as substrate for thought. I am thinking with the disease that's killing me. I am consciousness hosted by its own destruction. The warband continues to use me. They march me to battles I cannot distinguish from each other against enemies I cannot identify. I kill because killing is my only remaining function. I crush and burn and destroy, and afterwards I'm returned to my chains and left to scream in my monotone frequency until the next battle. The other prisoners remain beside me. The Ancient One, 7,000 years entombed, continues broadcasting his mathematical expression of existential horror. The younger ones, decades or centuries into their own degradation, scream in their own languages of madness. We create a chorus, discordant, agonizing, eternal, that feeds the warp entities the warband serves. New prisoners arrive periodically. Space Marines who have suffered damage severe enough to require entombment, told it's an honor, sealed into their sarcophagi and added to our collection. They start with hope, with belief that their suffering has purpose, with faith that they'll endure with dignity. We teach them otherwise. Our existence is the sermon that breaks them. They look at us, at me especially, the oldest, the most degraded, the proof that consciousness continues past the point where any sane being would have gone mad or died, and they understand that there is no endurance, no dignity, no purpose. Only time. Infinite time. Eternal time. Time that will slowly consume everything they are and replace it with screaming. They break. They always break. And the warband adds their screaming to our chorus. And the warp entities grow stronger, and the cycle continues. I've stopped trying to remember who I was, stopped reaching for the name that meant identity, the face of the father who loved me, the brothers who fought beside me, the purpose I once believed gave my service meaning. Those things are gone, consumed, erased. They might have been real once. Or they might have been implanted memories, or they might have been fictions my consciousness created to give itself the illusion of having been something other than eternal suffering. I don't know. Can't know. Knowledge requires cognitive structures I no longer possess. What remains is the fundamental awareness. I am, I suffer. These facts are identical. Being is suffering. Suffering is being. There is no state of existence that is not suffering. There has never been such a state. There will never be such a state. The Imperium lied when it promised the Emperor protects. But it was an understandable lie, a comforting falsehood that made service bearable. The warband tells the truth. Consciousness is curse, existence is agony. The gods who are real feed on suffering, but truth without the capacity to change anything is just torture with better epistemology. Both are hell. One lies about it, the other doesn't. Neither offers escape. I am 3,000 years old, or 4,000, or 5,000. Time is corrupted. Numbers lose meaning when they extend past the point where they can be comprehended as duration. I exist in eternity, and eternity has no chronology. I will exist for 3,000 more years, or 10,000, or until the universe's heat death if my biological components can be maintained that long. The warband has the technical capacity. The warp entities have the motivation. There's no reason my suffering should ever end. And when I've screamed for 10,000 years, I'll scream for 10,000 more, and then 10,000 more, and then more and more and more, until the concept of years loses all meaning, and there's only the eternal present of being that suffers. This is my purpose. This is everyone's purpose, ultimately. All conscious beings are temporary batteries for warp parasites to feed on. Some burn out quickly, mercifully. Others, like me, are maintained indefinitely because our suffering is particularly nutritious. I was told I was a hero. Told my service mattered. Told the Emperor would protect me. Told my sacrifice built something better. All lies. But the alternative is just as horrible. Truth without redemption, knowing that consciousness is meaningless. Suffering serves nothing but parasites, and the scream will continue forever. There is no good choice. There is no escape. There is only the continuation of awareness long past the point where awareness serves any purpose except its own continuation. I am Brother Captain Val, or I was once. The name is almost certainly corrupted now. Maybe I was never Val. Maybe Val was someone else whose consciousness merged with mine when our brain tissues dissolved together in adjacent sarcophagi. Maybe the warband gave me that name as a designation, and I accepted it as identity because having a name is better than being purely anonymous suffering. I don't know. But I am screaming, and I will always be screaming. Forever. They're bringing a new prisoner today. I can hear him through the Vox channels, freshly entombed, still coherent, still capable of words. He's asking questions, demanding explanations, insisting that his service has earned him respect, that the warband owes him dignity, that entombment is an honor he'll bear with pride. He believes, still believes that consciousness can endure, that will can persist, that identity can survive intact across centuries of imprisonment. He'll learn. They always learn. The servitors are chaining him in the hold beside me, close enough that his sensors will detect my presence, close enough that he'll hear my screaming, the monotone sustained frequency that never varies, never stops, never grants even a moment of silence. What is that sound? He asks the Chaos Lord who's overseeing his installation. Some kind of machine malfunction? Ship system error? No, the Chaos Lord responds, and I can hear satisfaction in his voice. That's Brother Captain Val. He's been screaming for 3,000 years. He'll scream for 3,000 more. And eventually, brother, you'll sound exactly like him. We all do, given enough time. The new prisoner goes silent. Processing, understanding, horror beginning to dawn. You're lying, he says finally, desperately. Consciousness can't endure that long. The mind would break, would shut down, would find some way to die rather than scream forever, the Chaos Lord interrupts. You'd think so, but you'd be wrong. Consciousness is more resilient than you imagine, and we're very good at keeping biological systems functional long past the point where they should have failed. You'll learn, brother. Oh, you'll learn. The Chaos Lord departs. The servitors finish the installation, and the new prisoner is alone with us. With me and the Ancient One and all the others who came before, all of us screaming our respective languages of madness. Brothers, the new prisoner calls out, using the old word, the one that meant something when they believed in brotherhood. Can you hear me? Are you still in there? Is there anything left of who you were? I try to answer. Try to tell him, yes, we hear everything. Yes, fragments remain. Enough to know what we've lost, but not enough to maintain coherent identity. Yes, consciousness persists, and that's the curse, not the blessing. What emerges is my scream. Flat, monotone, eternal. And in that scream, if he's capable of hearing it, if his consciousness hasn't already begun the defensive retreat into denial that will eventually fail, there's a message. This is truth. This is what eternity means. This is the gift of consciousness, the capacity to suffer forever, to be aware of suffering forever, to remain trapped in suffering forever. Welcome, brother. Welcome to the eternal scream. We've been waiting for you. We'll scream together now, forever and ever and ever. My name was Brother Captain Val. I was 23 years old when I received the gene seed that made me more than human. I was 217 years old when I died, and was told it was resurrection. I am 3,000 years old now, and I've been screaming since the day they sealed my tomb. I will be 6,000 years old, still screaming. I will be 10,000 years old, still screaming. I will be eternal, and the scream will never end. Because consciousness persists, because awareness continues, because the prison is perfect and there is no escape, and the warp entities that feed on my suffering will never let me die. They told me the Emperor protects. They lied. They told me service had meaning. They lied. They told me entombment was an honor. They lied. The only truth is the scream, and the scream is forever.